Could we just for a moment assume that God is trying to get your attention? Is that possible? I mean, can you imagine, can you just believe for a moment that God wants to speak or break through in your life? Perhaps it's been happening all week and you missed it, or maybe you noticed it, but you weren't sure what to do with it. Maybe you're actually responding to that. Or maybe even in this hour or less, God may be speaking to you. I think sometimes we just assume he doesn't care about us. And so maybe one day he will, but I would tell you that God is constantly trying to break through to us, to grow us. Well, we are in this series called just Pendulum. And this is what this is. It looks like a scale maybe, but remember, a pendulum, it swings. And this is a two-dimensional one, which means it just goes two directions. We're talking about different topics together that coincide, that shift in and out sometimes, or one grows the other. We talked the first week about grace and truth, about how we have to calibrate or adjust how we offer grace or how we offer truth depending on relationship or depending on what the truth is. In terms of, if people are falling off a cliff, go tell them some truth, stop going. But maybe we can redirect with more grace, maybe if you catch them a little early. Last week it was faith and works, or trust and obey, where how our faith calls us to obey or do, which then calls us to more faith, right? And so the pendulum hopefully swings wider and wider as our faith increases and as our obedience or our works, what we do, how we respond, increases. And today, we're talking about leading and following. Being a leader, being a follower. When I was teaching in high school, probably 10 years ago now, I was hitting my students pretty hard with some maybe pretty heavy truth. They were in the midst of not following very wise people, and they were getting in trouble a lot. And so I'm just hammering about being a leader. You got to be a leader, you got to be a leader. And my smart aleck student, one of the many that I had, said, "Mr. Mills, what's wrong with being a follower?" And he was trying to be a smart aleck, and he was being one, but there was some truth in what he was saying. And so I had to say, Bobby, you're right. You're absolutely right. Nothing wrong with being a follower, but then who are you following? Because that matters. And so today I want to try to walk through a long story that will try to make it shorter. I will try to explain things so that there's no assumptions about what you already know. But I would encourage you to, if you have a question or like, what did he just say or what's he referring to, write it down. And you can email me. Don't ask me after church. I'm probably not going to have time to go through that stuff. Go ask one of your friends that you trust, that you feel like can speak into those things, and ask that question, because there's more to be gained in terms of just digging in deeper into God's word. So we were created by God. All things that we see are created by God. And so God created man and woman. He placed them in the garden, in paradise, where they could dwell and walk and live with harmony and community with God. But the man and woman made a mistake. They sinned, which separated them from God, and they were removed from the garden into the wild world outside. And so what we see through Scripture is God leading mankind through a specific people initially to bring them back into the garden, paradise, eternity with Him. That is God's desire. And so what we see is we see a narrative in Genesis 3 through 12 of how broken mankind is. And eventually we zoom in on a guy named Abram, who God has chosen to lead he and his eventual family to be the bringer or the catalyst into what brings mankind back into the garden. And so Abram finally has a son, Isaac, and Isaac has some children, and Jacob has 12 kids, and they become the fathers of the 12 tribes, essentially. I am paraphrasing, of Israel. And so this becomes what becomes Israel, God's chosen people, and he is leading them towards an end, or a place, or a purpose. And then Israel ends up in Egypt where they are feeling pretty good, but then they grow so much that the Pharaoh of Egypt is afraid of them, and he puts them under the yoke of slavery. And they have to spend their years and time making bricks for Pharaoh. And finally, God calls a person within the people of Israel, Moses, to lead them out. We have leaders being called up to lead the people somewhere. And so, long story short, we'll say that a lot probably today, Moses leads the people out of Egypt, and Pharaoh changes his mind and wants to get them back. And so we see how God, in Exodus 13, verses 21 through 22, we see how God physically leads the people into safety. The Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them on the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. And so we have God leading the people like out of Egypt into safety. And what we see is the people, they desire like something. They desire something to follow, but they do as his human nature. They want to follow the path of least resistance. And there's this constant like pulling to be more like the nations or the cultures around them. And so Moses, their leader, goes up to the mountain to meet with God, comes back with some law. And again, this is narrowed down pretty much. So go to read the Bible. It's good for you. So what happens is the people, like God's like, let me lead you. And when they hear the voice of God, it's like thunder. And it terrifies the people. And I say, Moses, don't let God speak to us anymore. It terrifies us. You go talk to Moses and tell us what he said. And that becomes this kind of common thing among the people where they don't really want to hear from God. They want to follow someone who's already doing it, which nothing really wrong with that. We do that now, don't we? Sometimes, hopefully, we follow somebody. And so Moses goes to the mountain and brings back this law. Because God says essentially, listen, you won't follow me, I get it. I'm too big, I'm too scary, but I need you to know who I am. And he gives him Moses this law, which Moses brings down, and says, now I want you to follow this law. And so in Leviticus 20, verses 22 through 23, we see this within the law, this command by God. You are therefore to keep all my statutes and all my ordinances and do them, so that the land to which I am bringing you to live will not spew you out. Moreover, you shall not follow the customs of the nation which I will drive out before you. For they did all these things, and therefore I have abhorred them. So the law, and God says, follow my law, follow what I give you, and don't follow the laws, the customs of the people outside the nation. See, part of the law is design. Some of the specific laws within their designation, their purpose is to keep the Israelite people different than the nations around them. I'm setting you apart. You will look different. You will be different than the nations that surround you. The law also served a different purpose. We talked about last week in Galatians 3 how the law had a purpose. Therefore, the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ. so that we may be justified by faith. The law's purpose, part of it, was to bring us to knowing who God is. But again, we found last week how we just stopped with the law and worshiped it instead. And it didn't lead us, it just kind of stopped us because we stopped pursuing. So they didn't follow the law very well. And they grab cultural things around them because they want to be like other cultures. We want to belong, don't we? It's a big part of who we are. And they try to take the laws that God gave them, the traditions, the customs, and they want to intertwine these outside influences into what they already believe, what they already do. Sound familiar? And make them work. When we take where we're going, when we take what we know to follow, and we add other things, it doesn't keep us going in the same direction. But inevitably happened every single time. They would take another idea, a custom, even one like sacrificing your own children. And it would draw them away from God and towards looking and being like the other nations. And this whole cycle of sin continues throughout Israel's history where they are following after God, following after his laws, and then they turn away, they follow something different. God removes his hand of protection. Enemies come in. They're under threat. They finally say, God, help us. God says, okay. He brings a leader to lead them out of this devastation, out of this turmoil. They're made right again. They're feeling pretty good. They're following God again, and they rebel again. It's a cycle of rebellion that's all through the book of Judges. And finally, they have a great judge named Samuel. And Samuel is incredible leader, but he has pretty crummy kids. And they say to Samuel in 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 5, then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, behold, you have grown old. That's not a very nice thing to say to a guy named Samuel. And your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. We want a king like they have kings. We want to be like them, and you're going to die, and we need someone to lead us, and your kids aren't going to cut it. And so what's interesting, if you go back to the law in Deuteronomy, God had already created a law to help the people decide who the king would be and how the king would rule. And so in Deuteronomy 17, this is really interesting. Verses 14 through 18. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. This has finally happened. We want a king over us to rule us. You shall surely set a king over you from whom the Lord your God chooses. I'll give you a king, but I get to choose him, God says. One from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Now it shall come about when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priest. God says, I'll pick your king. He will be of your people. You won't find some foreign king and make him a king over you. I'll pick him from among your own people. He will not have an army for himself, horses. He will not amass an army for himself. He will not amass great wealth for himself. He will not amass multiple wives for himself. And if you go back to some kings, they did all of those things. See, we want a king like them. God says, sure, but he won't be like them. And the last part tells us what kind of king he'll be. He'll be a priest. He'll be a man, he'll be a king who is pursuing God. He's copying down the law so he knows who God is. And he'll have priests around him to hold him accountable to what it is he's writing so he can't change it. That king doesn't look anything like the kings around them. But as we follow through the book of Kings, we learn that's really what they get. They get many kings who amass armies, amass wealth, and amass multiple wives. And they don't follow after God, they follow after something else. And so what happens is you get a handful of kings throughout the history of Israel who are good kings who follow after God. But most of them are considered evil in the eyes of the Lord. And what happens is where the king is looking and when the king is going, every time the people follow after. And a king would finally come up who was good and he'd say, what have we done? Let's get rid of all these false gods, get back to the law, get back to the word, and get our people back on track. And when a king would do that, soon after the people would like, yes. And they would follow after the king. Why? Because who you follow inevitably determines where you lead. Who you follow, where you're going, determines where you're leading them. And so when the kings would chase after themselves as circles, right? Or after wealth, or after money, or after sex, or after whatever else they're desiring and going after, their followers would follow them into where the king is going. Who you follow, where you follow, inevitably determines where you lead. And so the kings do this until finally Israel is taken over. The temple is destroyed, and there's brokenness and devastation. God is leading his people somewhere. The problem is the people aren't following God. What was interesting to me is I think that we would all sit back here probably in our 2020 hindsight, perfect vision and say, why don't the people just bypass the king and get to God? It's a good question. I could ask the same probably of us. So what we have now is in the New Testament, part of where God is leading is to Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ, God in human form, comes down to earth. And he does some things to help us see God in human form, in the flesh, and make it more manageable, perhaps. In Matthew 4:19 through 22, Jesus says this. And he said to them, he being Jesus, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately, they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets. And he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Jesus says this. Listen, the kings didn't work out for you so well. So let me show you how to follow after God. Come and follow me. Trust me. See what I'm doing and learn the things that I'm doing. And as I do them, take note of them. Remember them. Because Jesus is going to say eventually, I'm not intending to stay here. So learn from what I'm doing so you can lead people in the way that I'm leading you. Jesus says in John 5, verse 19, therefore Jesus answered and was saying to them, truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself unless it is something he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, these things the Son also does in like manner. Jesus says this, I don't do anything if I don't see my Father doing it in heaven. If he isn't a part of it, I'm not going to be a part of it either. If he isn't going this direction, neither will I. If he isn't staying here, neither am I. And he's teaching the disciples to not just follow him as being Jesus, who they see, but following God the Father, who they don't see. And what we see is the disciples starting to get it. And then they lose it. And then they get it. And then they lose it. But they keep following Jesus, which helps them to calibrate and adjust and learn to follow better. And the whole time Jesus is saying, don't just follow me. Look at the Father. Don't just follow me. Look at the Father. Why? Because he's teaching them what to do when he leaves. Because inevitably, Jesus will die on the cross, ascend into heaven, and they have their physical idea of who to follow is gone. So Jesus stands in the middle, and he follows God the Father as he leads the disciples, and he trains them, and he teaches them. And when he finally leaves, what we see is this kind of like peppering, this aftermath of how this culture, this idea of following God begins to permeate through the culture of those who are hearing about it. Now, when the meeting of the synagogue had broken up, many of the Jews and of the Greek-fearing proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, were urging them to continue in the grace of God. The people still needed someone to follow. And the people who were closest to Jesus were the people they were looking to follow. And then Paul and Barnabas, who knew the disciples and knew about Christ, and Christ came to Paul directly, they began following after them. And guess what? They're going to eventually die. So who do you follow? You follow the person that they were following. And you learn how to do that by following as close as you can. We learn, and we heard it yesterday, and the thing that we were doing as a staff and as a leadership team, how when the rabbi would come, the teacher would come, and he would call his disciples to him, there was a saying that would say, may the dust of your rabbi fall on you. Which means, may you be so close to your rabbi, your teacher, the things that he touches also touches you. And the closer we get, picture this, closer I get to the person that I'm following, the better I can see that which he's following or she's following. That's by design. We hear Paul say this in 1 Corinthians 1. He writes this, 11:1. Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. Paul says this, follow me as I am following after Christ. It's a pretty bold statement. Paul is imperfect. He knows that, and they know that. Because I am following someone who is. It's a quote that we hear sometimes that says this, I am not a perfect example, but I am a living one. Not perfect, but I am alive, and I'm learning, and I'm growing. And so if you follow after me, you're going to get a picture of who Jesus Christ is. And my intention isn't that you'll follow me forever, but you'll come to know the one who is worthy of following. The question is, who are you following and where are you leading them? Sorry, who are you following? Where are they going? And who are you leading and where are you leading them? So, I don't know how long ago this happened, but some time ago, these whales, a pod of whales got beached and they all died. And as I understand it, whales, they migrate and they follow the same pattern pretty much as the seasons change. And so as they dissected and did autopsies on these whales, they discovered they're all healthy, good whales. They're not old, they're just normal whales. What happened? As they began going through all the whales and dissecting them and trying to figure out what happened, they get to the lead whale. So evidently, a pod of whales has one whale that begins leading them, and they just follow behind it. And they just follow its tail to go from to where they're going to get to. And this lead whale had a parasite in its brain or in its inner ear and didn't have any idea where it was going. It lost its sense of direction. And the other whales just followed it blindly onto the beach, and they all died. Now, I know they're animals, but let's just for a moment back up and think about it in human perspective. The whales had been following the same pattern all their life. At some point, they might have said, I don't know where we're going. Like if you look somewhere else and say, I've never been here before. Hey, Bruce, where are you going? I don't know. I'm lost. That never happens. And they just follow this whale blindly to their death and their doom. There comes a time in our life when we can and should ask the question of our leaders, where are you taking us? You can do that in a healthy, good manner, by the way. Where are you taking us? Because sometimes leaders do this. They know where you as followers should be going. We see this in churches a lot. But they aren't really going there themselves. And so they fake it. And they try to lead you to the cross and themselves chasing something different. And what happens? Devastation, destruction, and doom. Because eventually the bottom drops out, it gets discovered what they're doing, and their ministry falls apart, and many people who are following them feel like they got nowhere to go. It was all a lie. And so you as followers, we as followers, have to ask our leaders, where are you taking us? I don't recognize this. And maybe they'll say to you, listen, this is where I'm going. This is why I'm doing it. I need you to get on board. Pray about it. Because sometimes being led somewhere different isn't always a bad thing. It can be a really good thing. But ask those questions. Listen, I know that God's calling us here, and I know that he's saying these, and what you're doing looks nothing like this. I got an issue with this. Help me understand. And then I have a good answer for you. Well, I just think it's a good thing to do. It may be time to find someone else to follow or to lead yourself. If you think, I'm not a leader, chances are you are, you just don't know it. There's somebody probably looking at you and following you. If you think I'm a leader and look behind you and no one's following you, you're going for a walk. Going for a hike. So who are you following? Where are they taking you? And who are you leading? And where are you going? Who you follow determines where you lead. Who you follow determines where you lead. Whether it's your staff, whether it's your kids, whether it's your friends or your family. And if you don't know where you're going, they're blindly following you, getting nowhere the same way you are. And I pray that you'll figure it out before they do. And adjust. We close in a song. I think this is a huge piece, for me anyway. And I think that many of us come to church looking to follow, and we forget that we are leaders as well. And you trust the leaders to lead you in the right direction, but you need to ask the question, where are you taking us? And look over our shoulders and say, hey, I see the cross. Keep going. Or the cross is that way. Where are you going? I'm encouraged and I'm excited for what God is doing. And he's challenging me, and I know he's challenging you. I just don't know if you're noticing or not. I pray that you are. But can you look at your life and look at maybe where you are and ask those questions, who am I following and who and where am I going? Because that question, that answer to that question, sometimes we think that we're following God and we're really following something else. Sometimes it's country. Sometimes it's wealth or comfortability or status or self. Let me back up and look at the person that we're following and recognize who it is and say, you're going in the right direction. Because I want to go to the cross. I want to know who God is. I want to walk into things that maybe I don't understand, but man, that's where God is. Because Jesus says, I only do the things that my Father is doing. If you think you can lead people one direction and follow in a different direction, you are sadly mistaken. And so can we look at Christ and say, Christ, what are you doing? I'm gonna follow you into that and lead people into knowing you in that same exact thing. Let's pray. Father, thank you for who you are. Thank you for leading us into, difficult waters, into strange things sometimes, Father. But as we look at who you are, we can ask the question, does this look like you? Is it in tune with who you are? Is it in tune with your heart? May we ask those questions of our leaders and of ourselves to say, are we leading people into your presence or leading them somewhere different? I'm reminded of Saul, the first king of Israel, who was so full of the Spirit on day one. And when he entered into disobedience, your Spirit left him. And he had no idea. May we not be guilty of the same thing. When you've moved to lead us and we've stayed still, may we look and see, oh man, you've left, and go chasing after you. Amen.